Welcome back to CBC News Sunday. Misha Glenny is a former BBC reporter who covered the wars in the former Yugoslavia. So why is he now so interested in Canada? Well, there's the 24 or so gangland murders in British Columbia over the last 2 years, and there's the estimated 20,000 marijuana grow-ops in homes across BC. You see, Misha Glenny has become an expert in the international crime scene, and he views British Columbia much the same way he views places like Russia, Croatia, and parts of China. Hotspots of international crime, a new kind of international crime. As Glenny tells us, the shadow economy of crime is now a major economic and political force in the world. You could say crime really does pay. According to experts, the global shadow economy of crime is now worth an estimated $1 trillion. That's money made from drug smuggling, weapons dealing, human trafficking. But it also includes certain types of tax evasion, fraud, and copyright privacy. And the shadow economy is no longer run by local mafia families. According to the former BBC journalist Misha Glenny, they're now run by global syndicates every bit as sophisticated as Walmart, often working in close conjunction with corrupt governments, and, crucially, with populations who accept them as part of everyday life. In his new book chronicling the rise of this phenomenon, Glenny gives it a name, the McMAFIA.
I look at the mafia as an organic product of two phenomena. One is globalization, and the other is the fall of communism and all the unintended consequences of the fall of communism.
But while Glenny chronicles the McMafia's rise beginning in Eastern Europe, its impact is now seen everywhere, including right here in Canada. And there's no better illustration of this than the huge marijuana industry in British Columbia, which he features as a major chapter in his book. What percentage of the British Columbia economy?
According to government statistics, it's 5% of GDP of the BC economy. And 5%.
And that's worth what?
Oh, it's worth about $5 billion or so. You know. And BC Bud turns at an early stage into a brand. And suddenly BC's industry flourishes tremendously because it breaks out of the traditional areas of organized crime, like the biker gangs, and it breaks out into the middle classes.
Like everybody's got homegrown bud.
Well, 25,000, according to the RCMP, 25,000 grow-ops in BC in residential units alone.
Since the early 1990s, police have struggled to find a way to disentangle criminals from corrupt officials and from local populations who accept the existence of a black market and often, as is the case in British Columbia, benefit from it.
What we hadn't anticipated is that along with the collapse of communism, there would be a collapse of the state and state capacity all over Eastern Europe. And this is why you got these huge mafias emerging over Eastern Europe, because they were taking up the role of the state.
The situation in the former Yugoslavia, wars which Glenny covered extensively, was the first time where he saw warring paramilitary leaders in places like Serbia, Bosnia, and Croatia morph seamlessly into gangsters, often privately putting aside their own ethnic hatreds to make money together dealing drugs. One example is the case of Arkan, a man called Zeljko Radjanovic, who was a Serbian paramilitary leader and war criminal.
I don't give a damn.
Before he was assassinated in the year 2000, Arkan became very wealthy dealing drugs, often with the very people he was also fighting.
Arkan, the big war criminal who was assassinated in 2000, the indicted war criminal, he was once almost picked up by the CIA. And the place that they were going to pick him up was on the border between Serbia and Kosovo, where he was going to meet his Albanian heroin partner, his partner in dealing heroin. So here you are, you know, someone who had a vicious anti-Albanian paramilitary organization striking deals in the delivery of heroin to Western Europe with an Albanian from Kosovo. This was typical.
And the collapse of the whole Soviet bloc solidified the McMAFIA as a global force. According to Glenny, the people who used to be party apparatchiks or secret police in the previous communist regimes were now leading government officials and gangsters. In the McMAFIA, the globalization of it, the politicians are the mafia.
In Yugoslavia and in Russia, this was, and in Bulgaria, this was so evident, you know, that essentially it was impossible to distinguish between those people who were shifting the money, those people who were wielding political power, and those people who were involved in, you know, really violent crimes.
Glenny argues that the dark side of globalization has been that it's facilitated the growth of criminal syndicates, and so has the complete deregulation of the financial markets. Money, he says, is now moving so quickly around the world, no one can track it all.
This is the Achilles heel which enables all this to go on. I mean, you know, there were in the 1990s, there were discussions in the Clinton administration, for example, about closing down offshore banking centers.
So when people say, I keep my money in the Cayman Islands.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
Are these facilities for essentially holding and or laundering ill-gotten gains?
They are. And when you try and chase that money, you will often find that the bank account or the lawyer's office, which is holding that shell company, is a front for several other companies, sometimes just in the Caymans, sometimes as well in the British Virgin Islands, in Vanuatu, in Dubai, and so on and so forth. It becomes impossible to try and track this stuff. There is so much money swilling and sloshing around the world that it is impossible for governments to keep track of it.
Glenny also believes that the very expensive war on drugs approach to fighting organized crime has often backfired. He says that it keeps the price of drugs so high and so unregulated that criminal groups rely on it to finance their groups, something that he says is at the very heart of the situation in Afghanistan.
When it comes to Afghanistan, the war on drugs is undermining Western security and Western long-term security interests in that region, because by 2003, the Taliban was a defeated force. Militarily, it was completely out of the game. The British and the Americans, in their wisdom, decided to invade Iraq, and they neglected Afghanistan. So the opportunity we had, which comes along once every 150 years in Afghanistan, to really develop that country and provide some succor at last to the blighted people of Afghanistan, was passed up in favor of the adventure of Iraq. The Taliban understood this. They reorganized, they refinanced themselves, and they rearmed. And they did those latter two purely on revenues coming from the opium trading.
Why is this the case against the war? I mean, this is what I'm saying.
Because the war on drugs is giving the Taliban tens of millions of dollars every month, with which it is killing NATO personnel, British, Canadian, Danish, Dutch.
Glenny argues that one solution is to legalize drugs and let governments regulate the trade. He says this would cut off organized crime's chief financial tool. But there are other, perhaps less radical solutions, he says, that politicians can take right now.
Fortunately, in the European Union, we have a method which is accession to the European Union. What we've seen in northeastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, since they became members of the European Union, and since the European Union has targeted its economic assistance into distressed areas of those countries, organized crime is coming down. There are important long-term lessons to be learnt there. Secondly, the whole issue of good governance is really critical. We have to be uncorrupt ourselves, and if we come across cases of corruption, whether it's in Canada, the US, or Great Britain, we have to pursue them, because we have to set the example. Corruption is what facilitates organized crime around the world. Unless you get rid of it, you're in big, big trouble.
Misha Glenny's book on that's called McMAFIA, and it is worth reading for his investigation. All right, we're going to move from organized crime now